Hi, this is Randy Rice, and welcome to the Value of Testing podcast. Today's podcast is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to present a few PowerPoint slides in this just because the topics really do deserve some visualization. The topic today is how to create and maintain high-value test cases. And before we dive into the topic, I just want to say that I realize this is a controversial topic. I understand that there are some of you who absolutely abhor test cases or the idea of creating them or performing them, much less maintaining them. But I hope to at least inject some value into this debate, more or less, because one of the goals of this podcast is to present ways that we can see higher value out of our testing and that we can communicate that value. So I may not win you over in my arguments here. Actually, I'm not really trying to argue anything. I just am presenting why I feel that test cases can be a very valuable asset to you if done right. And that's the thing. A lot of people tend to create these huge libraries of test cases, thousands and thousands of test cases, and they can't really tell you what value they're getting out of the test cases. One of my Randyisms about test cases is that test cases are like kids. The more you have, the more you have to keep up with. The more you have to feed and clothe and send to school and all of that. So if you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about. Same thought applies to test cases. Every test case that you create and put into a library is one more that you have to maintain, you have to perform, you have to analyze, you have to evaluate. And there's just this burden of investment, more or less, of all the effort and time that you put into test cases. But I hope to show you in this podcast, it's really not going to take a long time here, but I hope to show you the value of test cases, which I actually prefer really to see as test assets. So let's get into this. Let's look at a few of the ideas here that I want to present around how to see your test assets as high value instead of low value. Well, first of all, let's define what a test asset is. It's really any reusable artifact that contributes to testing. Think of it as testware, and testware is an all-encompassing term. It can include things like test cases, test scripts, test procedures, even test data. It's basically anything that you use in testing. So you'll see here on the slide that it can be test plans, test cases, test scripts, test data, test charters, test procedures, checklist, API collections, regression suites and automation, test oracles. In other words, where do you get the knowledge to know if something passed or failed, as well as expected results. How do I know what the target is when I test something? And there could be others that you might think of that you would add to this list. One of the things that I have developed over the years is what I call the high-value test asset lifecycle. This is something I've put my name on. It's something that I have seen in practice. It's very standardized. There's no secret sauce really with this, but I do want to kind of go over it with you at the outset because this is something that never ends. You're always going to be dealing with some form of documentation, typically, if you're doing testing. Even if you're doing exploratory testing, you're doing work with test charters and things like that. So it starts out with a planning activity here where you define your scope and your objectives, and this is where you make sure that you're planning the right test. You have your goals and targets firmly in mind. You have your priorities in place. You know what the business goals are. And from that, then you can start analyzing the thing that you're testing. You can start to see test conditions emerge. You can understand risk about the item under test. You can look at the basis of your testing, like a requirement or a user story, and determine, is it even testable? You can start to see all of this emerge as this analysis happens. And unfortunately, too many people kind of minimize the analysis side. They want to dive right into test design or creating test cases or something like that. But analysis is a very important step here. Then we have design, where you create your effective and prioritized test, your test cases, your test procedures, and this is where you start to build your test cases out. You start to also establish traceability, look at test coverage, and start to get a picture in a more firm way of what you're going to test. And really, when you see test design done well, it can be a very elegant thing as everything fits together. But I always say when I'm teaching test design, as I was today in a class, that test design is a very nuanced activity. There's a lot of things around the edges, squishy parts in the middle. You just have to learn with experience and judgment on how to actually apply the various test design techniques. Then once we have those test cases in mind or defined some way, then we can put them in executable form. That's the implementation part of this. And this is where you might implement your test cases into tools, like a test management tool or even a test automation tool, or maybe even a spreadsheet. Spreadsheets are not ideal, but they may be what you have to work with. And then on an ongoing basis, you go into a maintenance mode. This is where you keep your assets relevant and valuable. As changes occur, you probably have to update your test cases. You also want to incorporate any lessons learned. And very important, you want to remove or retire any obsolete test assets that you have. And this is also where you monitor and improve quality. You can start to look at where defects have occurred and how you've picked up on those, and maybe add those into your test library as well. But you'll see at that point where the cycle just kind of continues on. So how do we see the value in each of these life cycle activities that I just mentioned? Well, in planning, you have value by getting a better idea of your scope and your objectives. You're not at risk of defining a great test for the wrong thing. So planning is very important, that even though people sometimes minimize that these days, it really does give you a better sense of who's going to do what, when they're going to do it, what kind of tests are needed, what's needed in the environment. You can get your resources lined up before you need them, and I mean not just one day before, but well in advance of when you need them for your test. Then in analysis, the value points come by being able to assess the basis of testing. Is it testable? Is it clear enough? Is it accurate enough? And you can start to see conditions emerge, and you can also start to see the risk picture get clearer. In design, the value comes in by creating effective, prioritized, and traceable tests. These are the tests that give you confidence that what you've tested actually does perform up to your expectations or to your user expectations. Hopefully you're finding some defects with those test cases, that they're not just simply happy path test cases, but they're also concerned with trying to show what doesn't work, as well as hopefully what does work. Then you have the implementation activity, where your value point here is to make your assets executable and reusable. The consistency here is really what you're going after. Consistency and effectiveness. It's really interesting when I try to describe what I do as a software tester to people who really don't know what that means. I will sometimes mention that there's several approaches to software testing. Some people take a purely exploratory approach. Some people take a more well-defined approach. And the the one response that is almost universal when I talk about trying to test without test cases is that people say, how in the world do you test something if you don't have a consistent way to measure it, if you don't have a way to repeat it? And I always respond, well, that's a very good point. And that consistency and repeatability is what we're getting at when we have really good, valuable test assets. And then the maintenance. The value of maintenance comes in by keeping assets current and valuable. You always want to be asking, is this test adding value to the overall test library, to our testing activity, or are we just doing it out of habit? Are we doing it just because? Now, I'm always very cautious before I drop a test case because, I don't want to miss something, and I don't want to lose a test case that might be an important regression kind of test. But at the same time, I don't want to have useless test cases hanging around. And so, as it says here on the slide, when it comes to test cases, more is not always better. And that was what I was getting at earlier, that the question isn't how many test cases you have, but it's what value are the test cases that you have adding into your test activity. So really, what defines a high-value test case? Well, first of all, it should be based on a solid test basis, like a good requirement or a good user story. It should be something that is really clearly testable. And that means that we can trace back to it, and it's something that we can really look to as our guide in evaluating a test. It also should address important risk. One of the big things about testing is it should reveal and measure risk and how we're doing against those risks. As we're mitigating risk, it should tell us if we're making progress or not. And it can identify new risk as they may emerge during a test. So the risk aspect of a test case is very important. It's not just about prioritizing tests. It's about really knowing the overall risk picture and how we stand in that. A good high-value test case tests meaningful conditions, not just surface conditions. One of the things I can look at when I do an evaluation of test cases in an organization is how do they look in terms of their structure? I mean, not just the format, but I mean, are they just testing one condition at a time, or are they trying to combine conditions? Are they just superficial conditions? I can really tell how deep a test case goes, and from that I can tell how much value the organization is getting from the test cases. We want the high-value test cases to be traceable back to our basis of testing so that if the basis changes, we know what needs to change in the test case, or if we're executing a test case and find a failure, we know where to go back to research it in the basis of testing. A good high-value test case needs to be prioritized. Not all test cases carry the same importance or priority, so we need to know what the really important test cases are versus the lesser important ones. And once again, that's primarily based on risk. It can also be based on criticality, which is related to risk. And it can also be related to things in the business. What are the business priorities? Something that people don't think about very often in prioritizing test cases is the picture of dependency. You simply sometimes cannot just say we're going to go very high risk, down to high risk, down to moderate risk, or low risk. Because sometimes to get to the high-risk items, you have to do some low-risk tests first. And that's just the reality of things, if you're especially testing from a scenario point of view. Also, can we execute the test case? I know this sounds kind of crazy, but sometimes you will find people who design tests that are very difficult, if not impossible, to perform. At least to perform accurately or with any kind of meaning. Also, the test case should be repeatable. It should be so specific and so clear that you can hand it off to someone else and they should be able to perform that same test just the way that you did. They should be maintainable. You should be able to write the test case in a way that makes it not quite so brittle to changes. In other words, the more specific stuff you put in there, the more breakage you're going to see when changes occur. Just as kind of an example of this, let's say that you're expecting to see an error message appear. Well, you have a choice. You can either spell that error message out exactly in the expected results there, or you can just say the correct error message is shown. If you go with the second version of that, yes, it's more general, it's not as detailed, but it doesn't break if the error message changes. You're kind of putting more responsibility back onto the tester to make that evaluation. Maybe they go back to the basis of testing or something like that, but at the same time, it makes your test a little bit less brittle. And finally, we want to see a value in test cases by keeping them current as the system evolves. Once again, you don't want a lot of old, meaningless test cases hanging around, and you want to make sure that you're adding in new test cases as you learn new things about the thing that you're testing. Basically, I think a lot of people kind of miss the value of test cases because they don't consider that what you're doing here is actually preserving organizational knowledge. It's a way of capturing that. It's not purely documentation, but without these kind of test assets, then whenever people leave, they take their knowledge with them. And there may not be any other way to capture this information. Also, you'll many times see the same defects reappear over and over again, mainly because we're not testing consistently, because people are making up the test as they go along each and every time. And new testers, when you bring them into the team, they tend to have to start over, square one, learning a system perhaps they've never seen before. And there's no place to give them any kind of guidance or anything like that. You'll also many times see the regression coverage start to erode because you're losing consistency in your test. And the lessons that you thought you learned many times get forgotten because there is no place to incorporate them back into the actual test that you were performing. But on the positive side, with the high-value test assets, you actually see a compounding of knowledge over time. As you continue to learn and continue to document into your test assets, you'll see that these become a very valuable knowledge base for not only you personally as a tester, but for your organization. Testing becomes faster because you don't have to research every test result every time you see it. You've identified it, you set it as an expected result, it becomes a clear target, and is part of your basis of testing. And you just don't have to spend as much time running down people, running down documentation someplace else to try to determine did a test pass or fail. Your coverage many times improves as a result of having high value test assets because you can go back to the basis of testing, you can see what it relates to, and it doesn't always work out this way because coverage can be very tricky. You may have weak coverage, you may have strong coverage, so you always have to look at that distinction, but hopefully your coverage improves in terms of depth, if anything else. Also, risk is better understood because as you continue to test things, you continue to monitor risk and you start to see where it changes, either for the better or for the worse. You'll also find that your new team members can get up to speed quickly. When you start to bring them into a project, then you can start to show them your test assets. They can work through scripts and they can go down through a test procedure. And it doesn't mean that they have to stop thinking, by the way. I always tell testers that just because you're following a script doesn't mean you stop paying attention to the things around the script. You can still engage your mind. And I think that's one of the misconceptions about test cases and test scripts. There's this mindset of perception, I guess, that people who work from test cases and test scripts are just checking things off as they go down. Yes, that probably happens, but there's a better way. And that's one of the things that I train on all the time, is teaching people how to not only follow the cases and the scripts, but how to ask better questions as they're actually seeing those test results. And then also, quality becomes repeatable. Once again, this is this point of consistency and repeatability, that you're doing the same test time after time, and it's very consistent. I like analogies, okay? And so I like to think about non-IT things when it comes to testing sometimes. And one of the tests that I often relate back to is just like when you go to the doctor's office. And, how would you feel if you went into the doctor's office and they checked your blood pressure differently every time you went in? They might have a different device. They may have a different method. Sometimes they may let you cross your legs. Sometimes they don't. If you know about blood pressure, the first thing they do is tell you don't cross your legs. And the process itself becomes very important. Even as they weigh you and as they take your pulse and other vital signs, they do it the same way every time because of consistency. And they want that repeatability. Well, when you think about how this all looks in the context of, let's say, an agile Scrum context, and we're going sprint to sprint, basically what happens is in each sprint you're going to have new or changed features, and so you have to ask what's new or changed in this sprint, and even the lessons learned. What did we learn from this sprint? And that has an impact on your test assets. You may need new tests, you may need to update tests, you may need to archive obsolete tests or adjust your priorities. Your output from all of that then prepares you for the next sprint. So you have to find time either in the sprint or maybe right after the sprint to make these adjustments. And so you have to get pretty good at doing it quickly. Now, this process really never stops. It, once again, just continues to evolve sprint after sprint. But the results are here that you reduce your risk, you catch your issues earlier because you have the right test. You can improve the quality of your test because you get better coverage of what matters the most to you, and you can accelerate your delivery because of less rework, which is lost dollars, lost time, waste basically, more confidence and faster releases, and that maximizes your return on investment. Keep in mind that it's an asset. It requires an investment. You want to get the most value from your investment as possible. You don't want to keep flushing it down the same drain every time that you do the test. Now, all of this is driven by your business goals, the feedback you're getting in terms of quality, and the team working together to make this happen. So in summary, there's many different techniques and approaches that you can use in testing to create these high-value test assets. The key really is to match the right ones to your situation, and this requires professional judgment and comes with your knowledge and experience. And the high-value test assets transforms your individual knowledge into organizational knowledge. And what that means is that if someone leaves, that knowledge doesn't walk out the door. It's retained in your organization. You can share it with people. You always have it. It's not at risk of getting lost. Well, I hope this was all helpful to you in this podcast. As I said, it's a little bit different. It's almost like a little webinar in a way, but I hope that it gives you some things to think about in terms of how you think about your test assets. Are they getting the value that you hope they will provide to your organization. Once again, they are an investment, and so you want to make the best use of that investment. If you found this information helpful, I hope you subscribe. I also hope that you maybe give me a thumbs up on it and share it with people that you think might need to hear this information. Well, thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Have a great day.